So this guy, his name's Gary, and Gary just got away with murder. And I bet you're gonna be glad he did. So the story actually starts with Gary's son, this kid. His name's Jody. He's 10. And Jody's an active kid, he really likes sports, and one day he gets involved in karate. And he really likes karate, and he's actually pretty good at it. And he also really likes his karate instructor, this guy, Doucet. He's 24. Now Doucet is a friendly guy, but teaching karate is his only source of income, so he's kind of broke. In fact, he's so broke, he lives at the karate studio. Now, Gary feels bad for Doucet because he's such a nice guy and he seems to be good with the kids. So Gary decides to let Doucet eat dinner with the family sometimes. He lets him borrow their shower when he needs it. And so Doucet, who's over there all the time, he ends up becoming a family friend. So now he's always teaching Jody karate, he's driving him home from practice, he's taking him out to see movies, and they have a lot of fun together. And this relationship goes on for a while. But here's where the story gets dark. Turns out Doucet is low-key a creep. And once the family starts trusting him, he starts testing boundaries with Jody, touching him when they're alone, seeing how far he can get. And this is a common thing that P3DOs do. They'll often test boundaries little by little to see how far they can get, to see if anyone calls them out on it. And they'll test boundaries with the parents too. They'll take the kid out for a few hours to see how long it takes for the parents to get worried, stuff like that. And this is exactly what Doucet does. And after a few months of testing these boundaries with Jody and his parents, he straight up starts essaying Jody. And he's always hanging around the family, so he gets to do it frequently, nearly every day, anytime he can get Jody alone. And the whole time, Doucet is pretending to be Jody's friend. He's always taking Jody to the local movie theater and on trips to karate tournaments and stuff. And Jody, with his 10-year-old brain, he doesn't know what to make of all this. I mean, he doesn't like the touching stuff, he thinks it's weird. But he likes hanging out with Doucet. Because he's older than him, but he's not nearly as old as his parents. But he is still an older guy, so he's still got that cool factor going on. So young Jody doesn't know any better, and he doesn't tell anyone about the essay or about any of the inappropriate stuff going on. And all this goes on for about a year. But then it really goes wrong. Because one morning, Doucet, he comes over to Jody's house, and Jody's mom is there. And we'll just call her Mom. And Doucet asks Mom if he can borrow their car, because he needs to run an errand. And Mom's like, sure, Doucet, you can use the car. And then he asks if Jody can ride along with him. And Mom's like, sure, have fun. So they leave, and several hours pass. And Mom notices Doucet hasn't come back yet. And she starts panicking. Where the hell are they? Did something happen to them? And so she calls police. Meanwhile, Doucet has got Jody in the car, and they're driving west because Doucet is officially kidnapping him. And they make a few stops, but then they end up at Doucet's uncle's house where they ditch the car. And then he and Jody, they get on a bus and they go from Louisiana all the way to Los Angeles. Now, Jody's 11 at this point, so naturally he doesn't fully comprehend the gravity of everything that's going on. I mean, he still thinks Doucet is his cool older friend and that they're somehow out on some kind of adventure. And so while they're in Los Angeles, Doucet walks them around downtown and they see a TV show being filmed and he gets to see the Hollywood sign. And then that same day, they get on another bus and they travel from Los Angeles down over to Anaheim. And they stay in a motel. And then the next day, Doucet takes Jody to Disneyland. And he's 11, so I'm sure he has a good time. Now, at this point, Jody has been missing for 9 whole days. And Gary and Mom, they're back home, and they're going insane. And there's a nationwide manhunt looking for these two, and the FBI is now involved. And no one really knows if they're ever going to see Jody again. Until Doucet makes a big mistake. Because that night at the motel, he decides to allow Jody to make a call back home to his mom. And so Jody calls his mom and they have a quick talk. But what Doucet doesn't know, and what Mom doesn't even know at this point, is that the FBI had tapped her phone because they were hoping that at some point Doucet would call. And they were right. So they traced the call, and pretty quickly, boom, police bust through the motel door, and bam, they arrest Doucet. Here's his mugshot. And Jody ultimately gets sent back home to Baton Rouge to be with his parents. But here's where the story gets really crazy. They put Doucet in jail, and 2 weeks later, they extradite him from California all the way back to Baton Rouge. That same day, Gary goes to a local restaurant to get lunch. And even though he just got his son back, he's still upset. I mean, police told him all the terrible things Doucet did to Jody. So Gary is just sickened by all this, and he can't get over it. It's eating him alive. Which I assume would be normal for any parent. I mean, your son gets kidnapped and violated. I imagine you'd be losing your mind too. Thinking of all the crazy shit, just wanting to punch holes in the wall. I mean, you'd be mad, I would. So anyway, Gary's at this restaurant, and a local news reporter recognizes him. And he's like, "Hey, Gary, do you know what time Doucet's extradition is?" And of course, Gary doesn't know. I mean, police never told him. But then, that reporter finds out the information. And for some reason, he goes back to Gary and tells him, "Hey, turns out they're gonna be bringing Doucet through Baton Rouge Airport around 9 o'clock tonight." And that moment is when Gary just snaps. And he decides he's gonna get revenge on Doucet. And he goes and he gets his pew-pew and he heads to the airport. Because he is not gonna let this slide. Shit's about to get real. And so he's there at the airport, and he's wearing a disguise, a baseball hat and sunglasses. And there are news camera crews and police all over the place, and everyone is there waiting for officers to arrive and perp walk Doucet through the area. And Gary, he gets on a payphone, and he's got his back to everyone so that no one will see him and recognize him. And that is when the police escort enters, and they're walking through with Doucet, and he's right here. And right as they walk past Gary, and Gary's here, he quickly grabs his pew-pew, and he points it at Doucet's head, and blam! Now, obviously, I can't show you the full video, it's way too gruesome, and I don't want my video removed, but the local news camera crews captured the whole thing. And so, bam, Gary is immediately arrested, and Doucet is rushed to the hospital, and there, he actually dies the next day. But here's the complicated part. Jody is actually mad at Gary over all this, because in his 11-year-old mind, he saw Doucet as his good friend. The guy who showed him around LA and took him to Disneyland. And from his perspective, his dad just suddenly unalived his good friend. And Jody stays mad at him for a long time. But eventually, they do mend their relationship and they make up. But anyway, Gary ends up taking a plea deal where the charges against him are dropped down to manslaughter. So at the end of it all, he only gets community service and 5 years probation for unaliving this predator. And ultimately, he spends 0 time in prison for this. And here is what he looked like in real life.